for the lectures is CG Jung Gnostic Visionary. So to give some context to the time and place, the world that Carl Gustav Jung was born into. He was born in 1875 in Deswohl canton of Thurgau, Switzerland. And his father was a Swiss Reformed pastor, but was stationed in a very poor area for at least for that time and place in Switzerland. So he grew up, kind of lower middle class. His mother, Emily, suffered from some form of depression. We don't know. And at night, she would spend a lot of time in her room, but he had a lot of visions, like outside of her room, different entities and such. So from an early age, he was really kind of plugged in, as you would say, having visions and doing sort of intuitive things. In grade school, he even took it was like a pencil case, and I believe it was, and at the end he carved a little figure, put it in his attic, and then he would go there with his own, this language that he created, and would write messages, and he said it gave him like a sense of peace. And later on, as he studied anthropology, he realized, there's certain tribes and that do this with totems and such as well. So at an early age, he kind of was plugged into the spiritual world. He did at one point, as he was getting into his teen years, think he wanted to pursue spirituality. And he started, I think when he got into college, he started studying, but however, he found it kind of just a little too academic, too rational, for his taste. He found it very uninspiring. Having a kind of a lonely childhood, which, as we know, a lot of times, sometimes people can have difficult childhoods, which pushes them to pursue spiritual topics, to go inward as well. So he started having a sense of the inner life and interest in mystical topics, as he got into adolescence. He also had a cousin who was into seances as well, which he attended, which was an influence. So you got to remember, so he was born in 1875. The spiritualist movement here in the US had been around since the mid-1800s. Mary Todd Lincoln was having seances in the White House. So just to give you sort of like the world he was born into. You already had Madame Blavatsky here with the Theosophical Society in New York. I'm not sure the original building, but where we stand is one of the Theosophical Societies. You have the one in Chicago as well. So this was a sort of, and you got to remember too, the ideas of like psychoanalysis, psychology, weren't really formed yet. So people think that, for example, hypnosis came after Western psychology. It's actually the inverse. You can go back to the 1700s. You had figures, like Mesmer, the roots of hypnosis. So Jung, as he got into his psychoanalytic practice and got more into what we now would call modern Western psychology, he did have an interest in hypnosis as well and practice it as well. So as his studies, deepened, he became a friend of Freud, and Freud was like older and a mentor to him. The thing was, they had a falling out because Jung was really on the cutting edge, talking about the kind of things we talk about normally, like in groups like this, archetypes, right? And the process of individualization, right? But these would have been very radical concepts, right? So the idea of has anyone ever heard the concept of the shadow in psychoanalysis, right? So like let's say you, from like 3 years old, you watch TV and you saw a classical performance. You're like, oh my God, I love this. And that's like our inner self. Like when you really have that, like I love that. I want to do it. But then your parents, society, no, you got to be a lawyer or a doctor. You got to do this. It's shutting down our inner child, are the shadows that are good things that are within us. And through social programming, social conditioning, we push it down. I had a psychology teacher in high school, and he'd always go, push it back, wait. And he would always speak with this German accent for some reason, but he loved Jung. He did a little, but he'd always talk about that, push it back, way back. And also all of the things like having visions, like we were talking about early children having visions and stuff, and then the rational world. No, that's all in your head. No, go back to the rational thinking, you know. And not to say we need rational thinking, right? For psychology, even for trauma, for if you need a surgery, healthcare, of course we need the rational mind. So I'm not dismissing that. It can save people's physical lives and alleviate pain, which is always important. So the process of individualization, becoming who we truly are despite all of the social conditioning from society, from family, and such as well. Concepts like archetypes, which Joseph Campbell in the last century took to the next level. He wrote a lot of books on, the hero with 1,000 faces, if I'm not saying that correctly, meaning that, you know, our image of deity comes in all these different forms, has different masks. Dream analysis and symbolism. So this in the ancient Mediterranean world, right, where from Rome to the east to the Levant, which is the Middle East, Mesopotamia, and Alexandria, in the ancient Roman world, it was all kind of one world that people were going back and forth from and having similar deities. And like so much of our culture comes from the East, the Near East, the Hermetic works, for example, that's the Egyptian Gnosis coming into the Greek mysteries. So to understand what Jung was sort of, the ancient world that he sort of drew from, it would have been in that ancient Mediterranean world. And he also, you know, did say he never really wanted to come out and say that he was like backed a certain type of religion or not, because he knew what happens within, his whole theory was the real masters come, or spiritual people that have the spiritual experience 300 years later, there's wars, people are killing each other over. Well, thank you all for being here today. So the theme, find God within themselves, but then people's, like we were talking before, the map isn't the meal, the map isn't the destination, the menu isn't the meal, it's that inner experience, but that's expressed in a multitude of ways. The types and images are different, you know, as it says in the Gospel of Philip, from the Nag Hammadi Library, which is a Valentinian work. The truth did not come into the world naked, it came in types and images. So Joseph Peloton, who had a Rosicrucian order in the late 1900s, said art is the servant of the gnosis. So, but that's different. If you can see Buddhist art, Christian art, and these are images of the divine that inspire us, you know. Jung also saw value in what we just celebrated, the Christian liturgy, the Mass. He saw it as the symbolism of it and the actual experience as a transcendent, you know, ritual. But he saw this in multiple, but this would have been around him in his time and place, so he would have saw that. But he saw the commonalities and the power of different symbols and rituals in different religions. So what we see now is a sort of syncretism of religion and spirituality. He was on the cusp of that of his time as well. And I mentioned dream analysis, interpretation of dreams, which in the ancient world, the ancient Greeks, the therapeutai, you would have went to the temple, slept overnight, they would have done rituals, and you woke up, they would have interpreted your dreams. I'm sure we've all heard the story in the Old Testament of Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. I think that was a play on Broadway when I was a child in the 80s. But yeah, the Joseph interprets the dreams of the Pharaoh and, you know, what's going to happen in the future. So that's always, in the ancient world, that sense of interpreting dreams was always there, and the symbols behind that. He also, some interesting figures that he influenced were he had interaction with were William James, who was a contemporary and also, you know, really into spiritualism and mysticism as well. And that was more after he had the falling out with Jung. So with Freud. So what happened with Freud was Freud kind of mocked his views, thought they were too irrational, and but ironically, at the end of Freud's life, he really got into doing, like, trying psychic ability, doing seances, ESP and all that. But, you know, he thought that, you know, Jung was a little too out there. But now, looking back, it was really Freud who was limiting himself, you know, to very a rationalist world. So what basically happened was when Jung was in his, which back then they would have said middle age, now we're just like, you're still a young person, he was in his late 30s, and he kind of knew about the subconscious. So even the concept of the subconscious, that we have a subconscious mind when we dream at night, we're going into the subconscious, that was really came from, not I want to say just Jung, but in a modern, bringing that to the modern sense, that really came from Jung as well. But anyhow, in his late 30s, he had sort of a break, you could say a breakdown, which became a breakthrough. But he kind of said, just like we look at our shadow, and if we were dealing with someone's trauma, we'd have to go back and see where that in the childhood that happened or in society. And he knew he had to go back to his inner self, the images, and he knew he was going to bring up a lot of dark stuff. Because that's the thing, for us to heal, we have to a lot of times confront dark realities about the world, our families, society, and a lot of times all that social conditioning when we're children, we're told, no, don't question anything, but Jung was on the precipice of this new breakthrough. And anyhow, he had when he was in his late 30s, and even his children witnessed this, there were these the door kept ringing, and he got kind of a weird feeling. He opened the door, he felt the presence of all these entities, and then I think it went on for several weeks, if not months. These experiences he had and going within formed what has anyone heard of the Red Book? Jung's Red Book? Okay, so the Red Book came out in 2009, and his family finally released it. They were a little weary of releasing it because it had, almost like you read the book of Revelation, but if you read it literally, it's all fire and brimstone and very grim, but he was bringing forth these symbols, both dark and light symbols. And just because of the time it came out, they thought, oh, maybe the world isn't ready for this. But in 2009, there was a tour all over the United States, and I think Europe with that. And does anyone remember the Rubin Museum on
Yes.
Rubin Museum? That was my favorite. It was really a modern museum. You could go there on Friday nights. It was only 3 levels. It focused on Himalayan art, Buddhist art, different Buddhist art from different regions. They had a nice bar, cafe, a store. You could go there on a Friday for free. A lot of times they had a bar with cocktails. And talking about, I got to work with them. So back, they closed, I think it was just after the pandemic, but back in 2011, a friend of mine, he's like, hey, there's this project at the Rubin Museum, you want to volunteer? And I'm like, what is it? You could pay a fee, I don't know what it was, but you'd stay there all night and you'd sleep under, just like these, like that one I think is ancient. But anyhow, you'd sleep under the original art that's like 3,000 years old. There were couples, some individual. So we had to sleep there, and then in the morning I had to go with a pen and paper, like, oh, you want to write down what you remembered? So what they did was that all these people who were on all these levels in the museum sleeping overnight, we had breakfast, we had like some Tibetan breakfast with Tibetan bread. It was really interesting. But then we brought everyone together and everyone wrote down their experiences, and there was a similar theme of, I think it was like a feather and eagle, but these had similar imagery, this feather and eagle imagery that was very similar. So it shows the power when people are together, just like we just did ritual, how there's a collective consciousness, and there's a global human collective consciousness as well. So even Jung saw things like, as much as the Catholic Church says terrible things about Gnostics like myself, Jung did see, though, that the sacred feminine was being suppressed because of why Mary is the patron of this group, Mary Magdalene, because she was suppressed because, even within the Jesus movement, it was very, sexist, it repressed women, and so did the Catholic Church, which it does to this day. But Jung saw the value of the image of the Holy Mother Mary. And it's interesting, that power is like on both sides of the Pyrenees. The Pyrenees are really a charged area. And on the other side of the Pyrenees, they started talking about the lady and the white lady. They would have this vision of a white lady. And then on the other side of the pyramids in Lourdes, was it Bernadette or the children who first saw that started talking about the white lady, which then started to look more Catholic because that's the milieu that was there. Everyone's Catholic, so they're going to start that power, that energy, and that doesn't make it invalid. It just means those powers are localizing itself to the local culture of the area. So we'd have a lot less conflict in the world with, some of the things, if we understood, oh, this is just the way people are seeing the deity, and Buddhists see it a different way, and people have tribal religions see it in a different way as well. But he saw the power that there needed the sacred feminine, and it's still missing, and that's part of why I started this group. I wanted to bring back the sacred feminine, and how it's the Gnostic, the sort of Gnostic, I don't want to call it Renaissance, but Jules Doinel, the French Gnostic Church, that was the revival of Gnosticism in the West, in France in the late 1800s. So Jung was part of that world. But anyhow, I'm going off on a tangent, but that experience I had at the Rubin Museum, to get back to that showed the collective consciousness, that whether it's in a society or you get the people together while they're sleeping and dreaming and feeling the energy of this ancient art, that there is something deeper within us, a subconscious, that we can pull these beautiful images up, that they can heal us, they can help us in our spiritual journey, our spiritual growth as well. So to get to the Gnostics, and so to get back to sort of Jung's perspective of, how do I put this, of not wanting, because he has already seen what happened with religion. I mean, anyone studies religion, like I was saying before, the cycle where there's something pure, and then usually some kind of totalitarian power wants to just like Christianity, it was co-opted by the Romans. They said, so if you have fear, repression, and guilt, you can control people. So you take, rather than taking all the good things, like the real Christianity, which was more Gnostic, was more accepting, understanding people, and you make that into about fear, repression, and guilt, you can really control people pretty well. And that's what, and I'm not saying all Christianity today is, I've been to Episcopal churches, I've been to Unitarian, like there's, within Christendom, there's also very loving traditions that people help one another. So it's not like a very black and white, there's a whole spectrum. But just to where some things went wrong in Christianity, I think Jung could see that as well. So anyhow, to get back to the Gnostics, he did say in interviews that historically the spiritual group that he most had affinity for and related to their worldview were the ancient Gnostics of Alexandria in the 2nd century AD, and that was, Valentinus, the Valentinians, you had Sethians, and that type of Valentinian Gnosticism is the least dualistic, I would say. It's much more hermetic, light and dark are just like the yin-yang. You got the light and the dark, but the light is in the dark is, and that's the world we live in, right? Every time there's divinity here everywhere, but there's also something dark next to it, like that's we come from a primordial unity, and we go back to that unity, that the pleroma as the fullness, which the ancient Gnostics would call. So what his work that he did, which was very seminal, was the 7 Sermons of the Dead, which was a Valentinian style work, but he attributed it to the Gnostic sage of the 2nd century AD, Basilides, and that was a tradition in the ancient Mediterranean. And even if you look at the New Testament, it was like that. Like the Gospel of Mark wasn't written by Mark, but what it probably was Mark was a disciple that was 18 years old. Then he has someone at that age as a follower of Mark in some part of the Mediterranean, and then that person's son or daughter might have started to put that into writing, into a book, right? But then the Gospel of John, for example, we don't know if it was actually John who wrote it, but John was 12 years old at the crucifixion. He was the youngest. He was a child still, so that's why that tradition, the Gospel of John, is written around 100 or so. So anyhow, in that tradition of the Mediterranean, he wrote the 7 Sermons of the Dead and attributed it to Basilides, which is a really interesting work if you ever get to read, but it's a lot like balancing light and dark, the opposites, and that's much more, I think, the Hermetic, Gnostic, or Kabbalistic approach, seeing things on a spectrum and reconciling opposites rather than, like everything is evil and there's only a little bit of divinity. It's like, well, no, there's like when you go into a Masonic temple, it's like a chessboard, the ground, or a checkerboard, light, dark, and the trick is to balance that, in the world and ourselves, as well. He was also a great artist. So if you can get a nice big copy of the Red Book. It's red because it's called the Red Book because all his notes were in a big leather sort of book encased. So that's why it was called the Red Book. And I think there's the Black Book that were just some simple notes that led up to that. I think that's accessible now as well. But anyhow, within the Red Book, there's beautiful alchemical art. He was actually a great artist. And at the Rubin Museum in 2009, when they had the exhibit, they had all that art there, and it was really beautiful, really colorful as well. So those are some of the notes. I think the Jung that maybe we don't see, maybe we see more. And I think he also had some fear in academia. He was trying to still keep everything within psychology, because I think there was a fear that, oh, you're too out there, you're not rational enough. So I think he had these fears of, he didn't want to create a new religion and have the bad stuff come several hundred years later. And also there was a part of his professional career, maybe at the time, didn't want to be stigmatized as someone who was not rational at all either, as well. And hence, finally we get the Red Book, I guess it would have been to see 2009, so at least he died in 62. So yeah, many years after his death.